December 1940, German bomber crews flying over Britain believed they had already solved the problem of survival. Daylight raids had become too costly after the Battle of Britain, with RAF fighters and anti-aircraft guns inflicting heavy losses. But at night, the equation changed. Darkness blinded interceptors, confused ground defenses, and gave German aircraft the freedom to operate with far less risk. Once the sun went down, the Luftwaffe expected to reach its targets and return with minimal resistance. For several months, that assumption held true. Then, without warning, bomber crews began disappearing. Reports filtering back to Luftwaffe command described a pattern that made little sense. Aircraft flying at operational altitude, maintaining formation discipline, were being intercepted in complete darkness, not by searchlights or ground fire, by fighters. Crews described sudden attacks from unseen aircraft that appeared with precise timing, fired at close range, and vanished again before defensive gunners could respond. Some bombers were hit so quickly that neighboring crews never saw the attacker at all. Others reported brief silhouettes beneath them moments before impact. It was not random interception. It was systematic. German intelligence initially attributed the losses to navigational errors or unlucky encounters. Night interception was widely considered impractical. Radar technology existed, but airborne sets were still experimental and unreliable. British fighters lacked the visibility and coordination required to hunt effectively after sunset. From a technical standpoint, sustained night interception should have been impossible. Yet losses continued to rise. Bombers that departed for targets in London, Coventry, and Liverpool increasingly failed to return. Crews began flying with heightened anxiety, scanning darkness for threats they could not identify. By early 1941, Luftwaffe staff officers faced a troubling reality. British defences were adapting faster than expected. Somewhere over the United Kingdom, RAF night fighters were operating with an efficiency that contradicted existing assumptions about aerial combat. At the center of the shift was a pilot who had no public profile and little recognition even within his own service. Yet his effectiveness was steadily altering the balance of the night-air war. The darkness that once protected German bombers was becoming a hunting ground, and the man responsible was only beginning his work. When the Second World War began in September 1939, most air forces still treated night operations as secondary. Aircraft could navigate after sunset, but coordinated interception remained extremely difficult. Fighters relied on visual identification to engage targets. Without daylight or clear moonlight, locating an enemy aircraft in open sky bordered on impossible. Early warning systems were limited, communications inconsistent, and radar technology still in its infancy. In practical terms, darkness created a protective barrier that few believed could be effectively penetrated. The German Luftwaffe recognized this advantage quickly. After sustaining heavy losses during daylight operations over Britain in mid-1940, German command shifted towards sustained night bombing. The transition marked the beginning of the Blitz. From September 1940 onward, waves of bombers crossed the English Channel after sunset, targeting industrial centres and civilian infrastructure. London endured weeks of nightly attacks. Coventry suffered devastating destruction in November. Birmingham, Liverpool, and numerous other cities followed. Night after night, German aircraft operated with relative freedom once they reached British airspace. British defences struggled to respond. Searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries provided some deterrence, but fighter interception remained inconsistent. Early night fighter units operated with limited coordination, often relying on visual sightings or ground observers. Success depended largely on chance. A pilot might intercept a bomber if he happened to be positioned correctly and if enough ambient light allowed visual contact. Such opportunities were rare. Loss rates for German bombers remained manageable, and the Luftwaffe continued its night campaign with confidence. Behind the scenes, however, British planners understood the vulnerability. If night bombing continued unchecked, industrial output and civilian morale would suffer severely. Within the Air Ministry and associated research establishments, efforts intensified to develop airborne radar capable of guiding fighters to targets without visual contact. Ground-based radar stations, part of the Chain-Holmes system, already provided early warning of incoming raids. The challenge was extending that detection capability into the cockpit of an interceptor. By late 1940, experimental airborne interception radar sets began appearing in select RAF aircraft. These systems were crude, heavy, and difficult to operate. Displays offered only approximate direction and distance. Reliability varied. Even so, They represented a potential breakthrough. If refined and combined with disciplined tactics, they could allow fighters to locate bombers in complete darkness. The technology existed. The doctrine did not. Pilots would need to develop entirely new methods of engagement, trusting instruments rather than eyesight. Few were prepared for that transition, but among those assigned to the emerging night fighter force, one pilot would demonstrate that the concept could work, and once it did, the Luftwaffe would discover that night offered far less protection than it once had. He did not arrive with the reputation of a fighter ace. John Cunningham entered the Royal Air Force before the war as a competent but largely unremarkable pilot, one of many young officers preparing for a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable by the late 1930s. Born in 1917 and educated in Britain during the interwar years, he joined the RAF at a time when aviation still carried elements of peacetime routine. Training emphasized formation flying, navigation, and daylight interception. Few expected that within a year, the nature of aerial combat would change so dramatically. When war began in September 1939, Cunningham initially followed the same trajectory as many fighter pilots. He trained, adapted to operational procedures, and prepared for conventional air combat. Yet by 1940, RAF leadership faced a growing need for specialized crews willing to operate at night. Losses from German bombing raids demanded a new defensive approach. Volunteers and selected pilots were transferred into night fighter squadrons equipped with modified aircraft and experimental detection systems. Cunningham was among those reassigned. Night fighting quickly proved to be one of the most demanding roles in the RAF. Pilots operated with minimal visibility, often guided only by instruments and occasional ground instructions. Spatial disorientation was common. Navigation errors could send aircraft off course or into collision with friendly forces. Mechanical reliability remained uncertain, and early radar systems required constant interpretation by a second crew member. Inside the cockpit, coordination between pilot and radar operator became essential for survival. Cunningham approached the role with careful discipline. He focused on instrument flying, communication with radar operators, and precise maneuvering in darkness. Flying aircraft such as the Bristol Beaufighter, he worked closely with his onboard radar operator to interpret signals from early airborne interception sets. The process demanded patience. Contacts appeared as faint indications on small screens, requiring gradual approach and careful positioning before visual confirmation could be achieved. Engagement distances were often short, leaving little margin for error once a target came into view. By late 1940 and early 1941, Cunningham began to demonstrate unusual effectiveness. He successfully intercepted German bombers during nighttime operations, achieving confirmed victories under conditions many pilots still considered nearly impossible. Each interception validated the emerging doctrine of radar-guided night fighting. Within RAF command, his result attracted attention. Within German bomber formations, they created uncertainty. The assumption that darkness ensured safety was beginning to weaken, and the pilot proving otherwise remained largely unknown beyond operational reports. The transformation of night air defense did not occur through individual skill alone. It depended on a technological system that was still experimental when the war began, but was evolving rapidly by 1941. At the center of this system was Airborne Interception radar, known simply as AI radar. Developed through British research efforts before and during the early years of the war, it represented the first practical attempt to give fighter aircraft the ability to detect and track targets beyond visual range at night. Early AI radar sets operated on relatively short wavelengths and provided limited range and resolution. Displays consisted of small cathode ray tubes that produced fluctuating signals indicating direction and approximate distance. Interpreting these signals required specialized training. Radar operators sat behind the pilot, monitoring the screen and issuing continuous guidance. Communication between the two crew members had to remain precise and calm. A misread signal or delayed instruction could result in a missed interception or dangerous maneuvering. Ground-based radar networks supported these airborne systems. Britain's chain-home radar stations tracked incoming German formations and relayed information to fighter control centers. From there, controllers directed night fighter aircraft toward projected interception points using radio communication. Once close enough, onboard AI radar allowed the fighter crew to refine their approach and position themselves for attack. The integration of ground radar, airborne detection, and disciplined flying created a coordinated defensive web that gradually improved in effectiveness. Cunningham and his radar operators became particularly proficient within this system. They learned to interpret subtle variations in radar returns, maintain steady approach speeds, and position their aircraft beneath or behind enemy bombers before opening fire. German crews often received no warning until the moment of attack. Defensive gunners scanning darkness rarely saw incoming fighters in time to respond effectively. Many bombers were struck with concentrated cannon fire at close range, giving little opportunity for evasive action. To conceal the existence and effectiveness of airborne radar, British authorities promoted an alternative explanation for Cunningham's success. Public statements credited his exceptional night vision, humorously attributing it to a diet rich in carrots. The story gained widespread attention and helped obscure the technological reality behind RAF interceptions. German intelligence took note of the claims but struggled to verify them. Behind the myth, however, a more significant shift was underway. Britain had effectively learned how to detect and engage enemy aircraft in total darkness, and that capability would reshape the air war over Europe. Each night followed a pattern that grew increasingly dangerous for German bomber crews. After crossing the English Channel and approaching the British coastline, formations expected the familiar rhythm of night operations, navigation by instruments, steady progress toward targets, then the return flights across darkened skies. For months, this routine had provided a measure of security. But by early 1941, a new defensive system was quietly taking shape across Britain, and it was beginning to produce consistent results. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming aircraft long before they reached major cities. Information passed rapidly through Fighter Command's control network, allowing ground controllers to calculate intercept paths. Night fighter squadrons were scrambled and directed into position well before bombers reached their targets. Among these units, Cunningham and his crew operated with increasing confidence. Their aircraft, equipped with AI radar and heavy armament, functioned as mobile interception platforms guided by a combination of ground-based detection and onboard electronics. Once airborne, Cunningham relied on a methodical process. Ground control would guide him toward the general location of an incoming formation. At a distance of several miles, his radar operator would begin scanning for individual contacts. As signals strengthened, the aircraft adjusted course gradually, closing distance while maintaining a lower altitude to avoid visual detection. Only when the radar indicated close proximity did Cunningham attempt visual confirmation. Engagement ranges were often short, sometimes less than 300 yards. At that distance, a brief burst from 20mm cannons or machine guns could prove decisive. German bombers began suffering steady attrition. Aircraft that completed bombing runs occasionally failed to return. Others were destroyed before reaching their targets. Reports from surviving crews described sudden attacks from unseen fighters that appeared precisely where defensive coverage was weakest. Some formations altered altitudinal course in response, but these adjustments rarely prevented interception. British coordination improved with each raid, refining timing and positioning. By 1942, Cunningham had accumulated a growing number of confirmed victories, making him one of the most effective RAF night fighter pilots. His successes reflected not only individual skill, but also the maturation of Britain's integrated air defense system. The night sky over Britain was no longer a sanctuary for German bombers. It had become an increasingly contested battle space, where survival depended on evasion and luck rather than darkness alone. And as interceptions became more frequent, anxiety within Luftwaffe bomber units continued to rise. What had begun as isolated losses was turning into a sustained and unpredictable threat. By 1940, German bomber crews flying over Britain faced a reality that contradicted earlier expectations. Night missions, once considered safer than daylight operations, were becoming progressively more hazardous. Aircraft departed bases and occupied Europe with growing awareness that interception was possible at any stage of the mission. Some crews reported seeing brief flashes beneath their aircraft before neighboring bombers disappeared. Others described tracer fire emerging from darkness without warning. Defensive gunners remained alert, but the absence of visible attackers made effective response difficult. The psychological strain of these missions increased steadily. Navigating at night already required constant attention to instruments and formation spacing. Anti-aircraft fire over target areas added further tension. Now crews had to contend with the possibility of radar-guided fighters approaching undetected. Evasive maneuvers disrupted bombing accuracy and formation cohesion, yet maintaining steady course increased vulnerability. German command attempted to mitigate losses by adjusting tactics, including changes in altitude, route selection, and formation structure. Electronic countermeasures were also explored in an effort to disrupt British radar guidance. Despite these efforts, RAF night fighter effectiveness continued to improve. Advances in radar reliability, communication procedures, and pilot training strengthened Britain's defensive network. Ground controllers refined interception methods, coordinating multiple squadrons across overlapping sectors. Experienced crews like Cunningham's adapted quickly to evolving conditions, learning to anticipate bomber routes and exploit moments of vulnerability. Interceptions became more frequent and more precise. Operational data reflected the shift. German bomber losses during night raids over Britain rose gradually, forcing planners to reconsider the sustainability of large-scale bombing operations. Aircraft and trained crews represented valuable resources that could not be easily replaced. As losses accumulated, the strategic value of continued night bombing came under scrutiny. Resources were increasingly diverted to other fronts, and the intensity of raids over Britain began to decline. For RAF night fighter units, success came at a cost. Night flying remained inherently dangerous. Mechanical failures, navigational errors, and the constant risk of collision or ground impact persisted. Yet the cumulative effect of their operations reshaped the nocturnal air war. By demonstrating that radar-guided interception could reliably counter night bombing, they eliminated the Luftwaffe's most reliable advantage. Darkness no longer guaranteed protection, and for German crews crossing the Channel, every mission now carried the expectation that somewhere in the night, an unseen fighter might already be waiting. History often remembers the loudest victories. Daylight dogfights, famous aces, and dramatic air battles have dominated popular memory of the Second World War. Yet much of the air war over Britain unfolded in near silence and total darkness, far from public view. Night fighter crews operated without the spectacle of daylight combat. Their success is recorded in operational logs rather than front-page headlines. Among them, John Cunningham stood out not for public recognition, but for the consistency of his results. By 1943, Britain's night air defense system had matured into one of the most sophisticated networks of the war. Radar stations monitored incoming raids across wide sectors. Fighter command coordinated interceptors with increasing precision. Aircraft such as the Bristol Beaufighter and the de Havilland Mosquito carried improved radar sets with greater reliability and range. The integration of technology, training, and command structure created a defensive system capable of challenging any night bombing effort over British territory. Cunningham's record reflected this transformation. Over the course of the war, he achieved multiple confirmed night victories, becoming one of the RAF's most successful night fighter aces. His decorations included the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross, awarded in recognition of operational effectiveness and leadership. Yet his work remained largely unknown to the wider public. Wartime propaganda emphasized morale and secrecy, often avoiding detailed discussion of radar-guided interception capabilities. As a result, many of the men who defined night fighting received limited attention outside military circles. Within the RAF, however, Cunningham's contribution was clear. His consistent success demonstrated that radar-guided interception could function as a reliable defensive strategy rather than an experimental concept. His missions provided valuable operational data that influenced training methods and tactical planning. Other crews studied these results, refining their own techniques and contributing to a broader evolution in night air combat. By the later years of the war, German bombing raids over Britain had diminished significantly in scale and effectiveness. The Luftwaffe faced mounting challenges on multiple fronts, and sustained night operations over heavily defended territory became increasingly costly. Britain's ability to detect and intercept enemy aircraft in darkness had reshaped the strategic landscape of the air war. For Cunningham and his fellow night fighter crews, recognition remained secondary to duty. Their work unfolded in darkness, often without witnesses beyond radar operators and distant observers on the ground. Yet their impact extended far beyond individual missions. They have fundamentally altered the relationship between technology and aerial warfare, proving that even the night sky could be controlled with sufficient coordination and precision. By 1944 and into 1945, the strategic balance of the air war had shifted decisively. Allied forces had established overwhelming air superiority across much of Western Europe. German industry faced sustained bombing. Fighter resources were stretched thin across multiple fronts. The Luftwaffe that once dominated European skies now operated under increasing pressure, attempting to defend territory rather than strike freely at distant targets. Night bombing, once a reliable method for striking Britain with reduced risk, no longer offer the protection it once had. Technological developments accelerated this shift. Radar-guided interception, refined throughout the early years of the war, became standard practice within Allied air defense systems. Night fighter aircraft operated with improved radar sets, more powerful engines, and greater range. Ground control networks coordinated operations across broader areas with increasing accuracy. The integration of these elements created a defensive structure capable of tracking and engaging enemy aircraft under virtually any conditions. Cunningham continued his service through the later stages of the conflict, contributing to ongoing operations and training within the RAF. Unlike many celebrated wartime figures, he did not emerge as a public icon after victory. His achievements remained largely within operational records and military history. Yet the methods he helped refine, coordinated radar guidance, disciplined night intersection, and systematic targeting became foundational principles in modern air defense doctrine. When the war ended in 1945, the nature of aerial combat had been permanently altered. Night no longer represented a protective barrier. Advances in detection technology ensured that aircraft operating after dark could still be tracked and intercepted. The lessons learned during Britain's defense against night bombing influenced post-war military planning and the development of integrated air defense systems across multiple nations. Somewhere in the early years of that transformation, during the long nights of 1940 and 1941, German bomber crews began to realize that darkness alone could not guarantee survival. Aircraft could still be located, approached, and destroyed without warning. An unseen interceptor could appear at any moment, guided not by sight but by signals invisible to the human eye. In those silent interceptions, carried out far above blacked-out cities, a new form of aerial warfare took shape. And from that point forward, the night sky would never again belong entirely to those who flew within it.